I'm very excited to be here. It's really cool to witness the beginning of a movement. I think we're all going to look back in a few years and fondly and remember when AI on the lot was held between screenings of The Accountant 2. So I've been in and around media for 30 years in a few roles. I've always had the same core job, which is to recognize the big shifts as they're happening. I don't know if we're going to go to the slides. Yeah, okay. To determine how they fit together, predict what they mean for the future, and then figure out what to do about them. So it's really this kind of pattern recognition, synthesis, forecast, call to action. That's basically what I do. So that's what I'd like to do today, is just take a step back and try to put the current moment in perspective. I think Gen AI is going to have a really profound effect on the media business in ways that most people, maybe even some of the people in this room, this is obviously a progressive crowd, you wouldn't be here otherwise, but I think maybe even in some ways that people in this room don't appreciate. My one sentence summary is that the last 15 to 20 years in media were really defined by the disruption of content distribution, and the next decade plus is really going to be defined by the disruption of content creation. I think it's really going to upend the media business, but it's also going to create opportunities. And I'm going to stay anchored to this thing because the only way I can't possibly see what's behind me. Here's our agenda. I'm going to start with the first disruption, how it got us to where we are today. I'll briefly touch on the current state of TV in the US as a case study in disruption, and then I'll talk about the disruption that's coming. AI is still at a very formative stage. So right now, I would say there's more questions than answers, but I think it's also very important to be asking the right questions. So I'm going to try to walk us through some of those. This presentation is going to be a little bit information dense, but at the end, I'll put up some contact information, and I'm happy to send the slides to anyone who wants them. You can, as Mike said, you can find a lot more about all this stuff in my Substack. I'll give everyone a moment to, sign up. Go ahead if you need to. It's kind of half a joke. I'm also in the process of writing a book about this, trying to draw the parallel between the disruption of distribution and this pending disruption of creation, due to be published next year. Okay, so let's start with this last disruption, the last great disruption. To understand what's happening in media today, I think it's really necessary to start with two foundational technological shifts that happened in the kind of 1980s to the 2000s, and that is digitization and the internet, right? Before that, media distribution was siloed. You read news in a newspaper, you watched TV on a TV, you listened to the radio on a radio, or listened to music on a cassette or whatever. And then what that meant was that each form of media had a different atomic unit, whether it's a letter or a note or a frame or whatever. Each had a different distribution infrastructure, different form factors, et cetera. And then what happened was digitization made the atomic unit of all media the bit, right? And then the internet unified all those bits on one network with basically just a couple of form factors, right? We all know this stuff. That really changed the underlying architecture of media in a fundamental way, how those bits move around, from siloed to unified, from one way to networked, from local to global, and most important, from very expensive to functionally free. And that leads us directly to the kind of 5, what I call tectonic trends that dominate the media business today. And I call them tectonic because they're mostly unnoticeable day to day, but they're very powerful, they're inevitable, I think irreversible, and this is really like the low background hum of operating in the media business today. It's price deflation, stagnation of the revenue pie, fragmentation of attention, the disintermediation of traditional intermediaries, and concentration of power in a handful of platforms and attention and a handful of hits. So I'm just going to go through each one of these relatively quickly. First trend's deflation. The idea that digital exerts pricing pressure on traditional media is not new. In 2008, Jeff Zucker warned media companies not to trade analog dollars for digital dimes. That was 17 years ago. I think what's surprising is just how persistent it is, that 20 years into this disruption process, it's still the case. So, you can see here that in video, Netflix keeps raising prices, but linear still monetizes 50% higher than Netflix and 3 times as high as YouTube. You see something similar in gaming when you look at console versus PC and mobile. A CD monetizes 10x what Spotify does. So the way to think about this is that the disruption of media distribution has really permanently shifted value to consumers, permanently. The next trend is stagnation. And as you know, ultimately the media business is about monetizing attention and engagement. We have a problem, though, is that there's no more attention to go around. What you can see on the top here, bit of an eye chart, but the average U.S. adult is spending 13 hours a day with media. It's 75% of waking time. And on the bottom, what you can see is a time series of time spent with media. It grew with the advent of mobile. We had a major new form factor, kind of flatlined, then we had this COVID bump, and it's really been stagnant since then. And so, with time spent not growing, it creates a sort of structural constraint on media growing. It's really hard for the overall media revenue pie to grow. And this chart is showing that globally, media entertainment is not growing adjusted for inflation. That's the orange line is the real number. This is all media. Like, this is not old media. This is everything. This is search and social and gaming and things that you'd think were growing. The third trend is the fragmentation of attention. And fragmentation is happening for one reason that's obvious and one that's not as obvious. And the first reason is that there's just this explosion of content due to falling barriers to entry. And distribution is the big one, as I talked about before, but it's not just distribution. You're seeing, to a lesser degree, production, monetization, marketing are all being democratized to varying degrees by new tools and platforms, right? And you can see this vast increase in content, particularly driven by creators. So for instance, Hollywood, by my math, puts out about 15,000 hours a year of new TV and film. And there's about 300 million hours uploaded to YouTube each year. So it's 20,000 times as much. If you look at music, independent musicians or non-major label music, there's about 24 times as many tracks uploaded daily. And you see a similar thing happening in gaming, where there's, maybe 10,000 games available on Xbox, there's 200,000 on iOS, and a lot of those are independent games. And all of these numbers are going to get only more dramatic as Gen AI advances. Like, none of this is really showing you the impact of AI yet. The pushback is most of this. I think you may have just said it. What did you just say? Someone said something. No, nobody said anything. I'm imagining stuff. That's a bad sign. Anyway, if somebody had said something, they would have said the pushback here is a lot of this stuff sucks, and that is true. A lot of this stuff is not good. A lot of it is empirically unwatchable. Whatever. It's not even AI slop. It's human slop, but it's slop. But that brings us really to the second and less obvious reason that fragmentation is happening, which is that the consumer definition of quality is also shifting. And I think, think about what's happening in TV as an example. I used to work at Time Warner, and the definition of quality in TV used to be an HBO show, right? It was like, big budget and high production values and famous actors and critical acclaim and all that kind of stuff. But what's happening in TV is that all those things still matter, but at the same time, there's these new measures of quality emerging. Is it authentic? Is it relatable? Is it digestible? Does it provide social currency? Is it relevant to my social network? Whatever. And so all of those things are changing the definition of quality for some consumers some of the time. And this is really happening across media. If you think about what's growing in media, it's YouTube, it's Roblox, even in music, it's functional music. It's not stuff that you would consider high production value. And you can see that here. Here's some empirical evidence of this fragmentation within different media formats. In video, I estimate that about a quarter of all video consumption is now social video. It's YouTube, TikTok, Reels mostly. In music, this is data that Spotify puts out every year. It shows the proportion of music streams that are represented by the major labels and Merlin, which is the biggest collective of independents. And major labels have been quite resilient despite this, this enormous increase in supply of music, but still their share of streams falls every year. So in 2017, they had 90% of streams. Now we're, getting closer to 70. And in gaming, a decade ago, casual mobile didn't exist. Now it's half of the gaming business. And a lot of these are independent games. So that was consumption. Now let's talk money. By my estimates, the creator economy is now about $250 billion. So that's roughly 15% of the total media and entertainment market. But in the last 4 years, it has represented about half the growth. And so if you sort of step back and think about the last few slides I showed you that the volume of creator content is multiples, orders of magnitude bigger than, or at least multiples bigger than what you could call corporate media content. Consumption is maybe 25% of the total, roughly, rough justice, and monetization is maybe 15% of the total. It is a safe bet that all of these numbers are going up. And so within the context of what I was showing you before, this kind of fixed pool of value, it means that the creator economy broadly is invariably going to continue taking share of value. All right, so the fourth tectonic trend is disintermediation of traditional intermediaries. And this shows kind of the historical media value chain. You have creatives and producers, publishers, aggregators, distributors, and consumers, right? Here is another way of showing the same thing. And the point here is that most of the household names in media, the most powerful names in media, are really intermediaries. They're really middlemen between the people who make the stuff and the people who consume the stuff. Studios, music labels, video game publishers, newspapers, whatever. They have all extracted most of the value in media historically because they do things that are very hard for creatives to do themselves, right? They finance production, they arrange the marketing, they assemble talent, they do the distribution, all that stuff. But what's happening now is that technology, if you think about this progression from one slide, look at the blue box in the middle, creators are moving down the stack, right? That technology is making it easier for creators to do all these things themselves. And so what that's doing is it's shifting bargaining power to the creatives over these intermediaries, or it's enabling them to circumvent them altogether, right? That's what a creator is, someone who's basically circumvented the traditional middlemen. But when you think about things like Taylor Swift saying, I don't need a studio, I'm going to create the Eras Tour movie by myself and distribute it myself, or you look at this recent Ryan Coogler news, which I guess is not precedent breaking, but this idea that you're going to have a rights reversion in motion pictures is quite uncommon. It's indicative. It's a nuanced thing because this kind of shift in bargaining power happens deep in the bowels of contracts and stuff that you don't see, but it's also happening. Think about how much more leverage a new musician has that now than 10 years ago, because they walk in the door, they have a couple hits on SoundCloud, they have 200,000 followers, they're already making money on Spotify. The last trend is what happens when so much media consumption shifts to networks. And as I mentioned, pre-internet, most media distribution was one way. Now most media is consumed on networks, which are two-way. And I would say the most important thing about networks is that they're subject to very, very powerful positive feedback loops that make strong things stronger. So there is a supply side and a demand side dynamic here. The supply side dynamic is you have network effects, right? And network effects result in this unprecedented power for platforms, or what somebody yesterday referred to as the new gatekeepers, right? And what this chart here shows is the market cap. It's a little dated, but indicative. It shows the market cap of the biggest platforms relative to media, and the point is that the smallest platform, Meta, is bigger than the whole media industry combined. And what you see here on the right is global ad revenues, and those tiny little blue blips are media companies, and the rest are the tech platforms. So the point in these charts is that what we call media companies are now a tiny part of the media industry. So there's also this demand side dynamic, which is that these positive feedback loops tend to amplify popularity. And that's because consumers, especially in this very noisy world with so much supply of content, consumers consider popularity a signal of quality or a unit of social currency, right? So you see what's popular, you consume what's also popular. So the biggest hits are getting bigger than ever, and you have these big cultural touchdowns. You have Taylor Swift, you have GTA, you have Barbenheimer, whatever. So even though the tail's getting longer because of fragmentation, the head is getting higher because of this positive feedback loop. And you end up with these kind of power law-like distributions. I don't even know if you can read this, but I guess you can. This is like the first time anyone's ever been able to read this slide. But anyway, this is an analysis I did on box office and on patrons on Patreon and songs on Spotify, titles on Netflix. And so it's subtle, but if you look at a time series, you actually see that these are becoming more extreme over time, is that the head is getting relatively higher and the tail is getting relatively longer. And this is changing the economics of media in a few ways. One is it makes the business riskier because the distribution of returns has become wider. The middle is getting hollowed out. You used to be able to make money in the middle, like, think mediocre cable networks or mediocre radio stations or whatever. There's really no middle anymore. And it also shifts even more bargaining power to the top 0.1%, because if you're at the head of the head of the head, you know it, and you're going to extract that leverage. So that's the current state. I don't know if this is depressing or not, but just based on your faces, it looks really depressing. But this is the current state, right? Like I said, this is the kind of the inevitable reality, the low background hum of operating in media today, is that you have this persistent price deflation, you have stagnation of the pie, you have this fragmentation of attention, the weakening role of intermediaries, and this kind of concentration of power in a new place, and these new gatekeepers and attention in a few hits. All right, so let's talk quickly about how these trends are affecting Hollywood specifically, this kind of case study and disruption. And I'm going to move quickly through this because I think there's a lot of stuff but if you're familiar with Clay Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation, this chart shows how Netflix ran the whole disruption playbook to a T, right? Disruption always starts from the bottom. That's what they did. They started with crappy, deep library movies and TV shows. And they picked off kids, and they picked off unscripted, and they picked off originals. And today, Netflix, I think, is undoubtedly the most powerful company in Hollywood. So I'm going to come back to this chart later. That's what you call foreshadowing. Which is a literary device. Okay, so I won't belabor this, you all know it, but as a result of this disruption, linear TV is really suffering, pay TV subs are falling, viewership is falling other than sports, the viewership declines are most dramatic in the youngest cohorts, that stuff. The conglomerates, the big media companies' response to this, of course, has been to launch their own streaming services, the Disney Plus and Paramount, Peacock, and HBO Max, or HBO or Max, or HBO, or I don't remember, whatever it's called. The artist formerly known as something. But anyway, they spent a ton of money ramping up production, and this is showing you originals in the US. They also lost $30 billion cumulatively between 2020 and 24. And what you can see here is that profitability has improved in 2024, but there is no real visibility of streaming profits replacing lost linear profits. And the reason for that gets back to the deflation point that I made earlier, which is that streaming monetizes at a lower rate than pay TV on a per home basis. And so here you can see that the average pay TV household generates 3 times as much subscription revenue, 7 times as much ad revenue, and that gap will probably narrow over time, but it probably will never close. And so this shows you total video revenue in the US, and the point here is, the orange section is streaming, and the blue section is everything else, which is linear plus home video plus box office. And the point here is that video really hasn't grown in the United States in a decade, because the growth in streaming is basically just offsetting the decline in everything else. And of course, it is declining, again, on an inflation-adjusted basis. The bottom line of all of this is that video profits are now down for the big media companies. So this chart is showing you all video for the media conglomerates. The blue bar is revenue. The orange is operating cash flow. And so what you can see is that from 2017 to 2024, revenue didn't really grow. So sorry, when I say all video, so this is linear plus streaming plus studio. So this is all revenue you could derive from video. So revenue barely grew up, modestly over that time frame, and profits were down about 30%. So when you consider the problems in Hollywood today, right, when you think about morale or reduced production or everything that's going on right now, it's really because there's just less money in the system. That's all. There's just less money in the system, and it's for these structural reasons. Of course, stocks suffered. What's interesting, and this is dated, but the green bar is Netflix. The rest is the rest of media. Netflix is now bigger than, the market cap is bigger than the rest of the media industry combined. Okay, so let's just take a beat here, move into our third and final section. I have no idea how I'm doing on time, but no one's yelled at me, so that's good. Everything that we've talked about so far is a lagging indicator of the last disruption, right? The plummeting cost to move bits around. All the tumult in the industry has nothing to do with AI. And now this next disruption is coming. That's why we're here today, because just to draw this parallel, just as the internet was this new general purpose technology to move bits, Gen AI is a general purpose technology to make bits. And video of all media is maybe the most susceptible here, because the entire business model is built on the cost structure, right? It's built on this cost, this kind of model of scarcity. As you know, one person can write a book, and Billie Eilish and her brother can make a multi-platinum album in his bedroom studio or whatever. I don't need to tell you. You still need like hundreds or sometimes thousands of people to make a premium TV or a blockbuster film. I also don't need to tell you that AI video models have made astounding progress in the last couple years. And normally, if I was like talking to a traditional media company, this is the part where I would show some cool videos, and I'd show like this canonical Will Smith eating spaghetti thing that was so disturbing, and I'd show like a Dave Clark or Nick Cleveroff or Jason Zada or Paul Trillo or Chad Nelson, some really cool thing. I'm not going to do that because you guys have seen all those, or maybe even, depending on who you are, made them. So I'm not going to show you that today. We all know this disruption is coming, but what exactly does that mean? How is it really going to affect the creation and distribution of value in the media business? And the answer is we do not know and cannot know that yet. But just to take a cue from this Einstein quote, what we can do is make sure we're asking the proper questions. So what I want to do for the rest of the time here, I'm doing pretty good on time, is just to kind of walk through a few of these questions, these like kind of key, what I call known unknowns, because there's unknown unknowns too. But let's talk about the key known unknowns. And as we go through this, there is actually a logic to the sequence of how I go through these questions. All right. The first one is, how much is AI really going to bring down costs? And I think like the answer to most questions, it depends. This is this chart from the recent Fabric report. I saw it like 6 times yesterday, so figure 7 times the charm. But it makes the point that there's this, you can approach AI filmmaking along a continuum, right? At one extreme on the right, you can prioritize control and try to plug it into existing workflows. And then on the other end, on the left, you can prioritize efficiency by starting AI first. And so this is definitely an eye chart. I mean, the former approach of plugging into existing workflows, are going to yield incremental benefits. Maybe you're going to get 10 or 15%. There's people in this room who could make a much better version of this chart, or much more up to date on the state of the art than I am. The point here is that from what I've seen, a lot of the studios, the major studios, are experimenting very quietly with, localization services and maybe some VFX automation and some stuff in nothing final pixel. They're approaching it in a very cautious and incremental way. And then you have the other extreme, which could really yield massive cost savings, because let's just say for the sake of argument that you're always going to need human oversight and judgment and artistry, which is something I believe. The number of people that you then need is probably approximated by the above-the-line talent in a normal production, roughly, right? And on the average blockbuster film, that's less than 20% of the cost. And so what that means is that other 80%, all below the line, the post-production, other, today on a traditional blockbuster film, that's like $1 to $2 million a minute, right? eventually over the next 5 to 10 years, that may approach the cost of compute, like 4 or 5 orders of magnitude less. And to state the obvious, that would dramatically change the barriers to entry to create narrative video, if that's what happens. All right. Now, the next logical question is, okay, great, but how good is it really going to get? I think it's unquestionably keep getting better for a few reasons. First is that frontier research in AI is not focused on video, but video is going to benefit. So if you think about like world models, which are really going after the prize of better autonomous vehicles or robotics or digital twins or whatever, that's what they're going after. But video will benefit from it. Second, there is no fundamental technical constraint to these models getting much better because bits are bits. All media, sometimes we forget that all media is an abstraction of reality, right? Whether it started as analog or started as digital, if it was digitized, if it's represented digitally, it has been abstracted into bits. Those bits are no different than generated bits. So there is no technical wall here that you can't cross. And the third thing, it's also important to keep in mind that humans are prone to constructing patterns from limited information. We want to do this. This is how we function in the world. The implication is that AI video does not actually need to be perfect. It just needs to be conducive. It needs to convey information in a way that's conducive to human perception. But the bad news is just because it's going to keep getting better doesn't mean you're going to quickly traverse this last 10 or 20%. And I won't go through this in any depth, but obviously, the uncanny valley is an extraordinarily high bar because we have 150,000 years of evolution of being attuned to the most subtle cues in facial expressions, right? Models continue to struggle with complex physics, like my model breaker is man in a smoky pool hall breaking a rack of balls. Go home and try that. I've never seen any model come anywhere close. I'm not testing these models every day, but if anyone could actually get a model to figure out what that means, let me know. A brief interruption here and an update. After the presentation, Matt Wendhart from Jenny Studios approached me and said, I just ran your model breaker in VO3 and it looked great, and here it is, so I stand corrected. Okay, another wild card is whether consumers are going to embrace it and for which use cases. My bet is that it's only a matter of time, and the point of this slide is that the history of film is essentially a history of increasing degrees of syntheticism. That's a hard word to say, by the way, syntheticism. When you think about like stop motion and maquettes to CGI to performance capture and virtual production, whatever, that's been happening since film began, and consumers don't care as long as it doesn't take them out of the story, right? But again, the reality is we just don't know, and AI is a lot more emotionally charged than those other examples I gave you. And so as it progresses and it threatens more jobs, by the way, I am like now a Waymo addict. Like I've Waymoed, I've been doing so much Waymoing here, and I didn't realize how much I enjoyed not having to have awkward conversation. But anyway, I mean, like you could just see there will potentially be this very visceral backlash, to especially if people are losing jobs, and especially if it's a genre that is intended to convey some sort of humanity, right? So you can imagine that along this continuum, some genres are going to pose less resistance than others. So, social and memes will be first, and then ads and animation and music videos, and then educational and docudrama. Obviously comedy and drama will be the very last to go, if ever. Okay, so we're building here, believe it or not. The next logical question is, all right, then how disruptive will it be to Hollywood? If you don't work at a traditional studio, you may think that you actually don't have a dog in this fight. And I would say you do. Everyone has a dog in this fight, because the more disruptive it is, the less profit there's going to be for everybody. And I think, implicit, just to make this point, implicit in this question is that disruption can mean different things. Sometimes it means that a business is destroyed, like what digital photography did to Kodak, and sometimes there's room for the new competitor, as is the case with Airbnb and Marriott, right? So disruption does not always mean death. It just means that there's a new entrant in the market, they're going to take some share. In this case, Gen AI has the potential to be extremely disruptive because I think it's going to exacerbate the low-end disruption that's already happening. And what this is showing you is this chart on the left is that YouTube is now the #1 streaming service to televisions in the United States. More than Netflix, and it's more than everything else combined. You know, it's more than Hulu plus Max plus Roku plus Tubi plus Peacock, but whatever. It's more than all of those. And on the right, you can see the time series of this, that is up 50% in the past 2 years. And so before, I showed a slide illustrating how Netflix disrupted Hollywood from the inside, meaning by making the same kind of content at the same cost in the same way. But now creators are disrupting TV from the outside. And as I said before, the way disruption always works is it starts from the bottom. And so what's happened here is that creators, as exemplified here with this YouTube line, have already picked off kids. You know, the kids business is gone. YouTube has taken it over. The most popular kids show in the world is Cocomelon on YouTube. Then the next thing will be unscripted. The most popular unscripted show in the world, if you think about it as a show, is Mr. Beast on YouTube. And so the idea here is that, you know, Gen AI throws gas on the fire and enables the quality of creator content to continue moving up this performance curve. So there's a really important implication here. It's this kind of key insight, which is that Gen AI does not need to produce comparable quality to Hollywood to be extremely disruptive to Hollywood. And that's especially at a time, as we talked before, when consumers are de-emphasizing high production values. And so that's the sort of provocative title of this slide here, is if it can produce 80% of the quality at less than 10% of the cost, that would really upend the TV business. And of course, this slide is comparing the cost of a Pixar movie with Where the Robots Grow, which I'm sure you're all aware of, which is billed itself as the first feature-length AI-enabled animated film. You can see it costs 99% less. Is it Pixar quality? It is not, but it doesn't need to be, especially if you're 5 years old. Okay, so how fast does this happen? We're wrapping up soon. And the answer is it could happen relative to the last disruption. It could happen pretty fast for a few reasons. One is we're dealing with internet scale, right? So this is not one entity, Netflix, disrupting the TV business. This is a near infinite number of you know, this is like in a Game of Thrones context, there's a lot of discussion about like, the Khaleesi versus the Kingdom of the North versus the Lannisters or whatever, but the army of the dead is at the wall, right? The army of the dead, an infinite army of the dead, which is creators. And so, which is not to denigrate them. And it's actually a really bad analogy because I hope I don't spoil this show that was on like however many years ago, but at the end, Arya does the thing with the knife and anyway, whatever. It's a bad analogy because the White Walkers all died. But sorry if you were going to watch it tonight. But anyway, before I mention that Hollywood puts out about 15,000 hours of fresh content a year, YouTube has 300 million hours uploaded a year. What that means is that if 0.01% of that 300 million hours is considered competitive, and that's why I don't use the word comparable, but competitive, that would be double. That's 30,000 hours a year. That's twice Hollywood's annual output. Second is that the last disruption required a huge lift in infrastructure, digging trenches, pulling fiber, cell towers. You don't need any of that anymore. You also don't need this huge change in consumer behavior in terms of adopting broadband, adopting streaming. The third thing is that the major studios are really not well positioned to head this off for a variety of reasons. They're, obviously there's unresolved legal issues. They're afraid of talent backlash. I think the biggest problem is just cultural. They were disrupted by a change in content distribution. Content creation is much more core to what they do. And I think that, I haven't seen that many traditional studios here, which I think is kind of telling. Okay. Second to last question? I think second to last question. Is our current thinking too limited? Most of the focus that I've heard at this conference over the last day is really about making TV shows and movies more efficiently, doing the same thing for less. My bet is that that's not going to be the killer use case of Gen AI. All new media starts out as an imitation of the prior medium, or what's called skeuomorphism, right? The first magazines were static PDFs. The first films were basically recorded stage plays. The first online video was like download or streaming. And then what happens is, and really a new medium only really flourishes when the creatives figure out what are the unique attributes of this medium and how do we use it to do unique things, right? And so, in online publishing, it's hypertext links and infinite scroll and embedded, video and blogs and newsletters, blah, blah. Anyway, you could read this. But, just think about video, and we have short form and vertical and ASMR and new content formats and vlogs and all this stuff, live streaming, whatever. So the question here is, and I want to give a prop to Mike, not only because he gave me such a lovely introduction, but we were talking about this over a beer once, and he's like, I don't want to do that. I want to do something that's neumorphic. I'm like, neumorphic? I like that. So Mike gets credit for coining the word neumorphic. Question is, what is the neumorphic? What are the neumorphic applications of generative AI video? We don't know yet, right? But what we do know is that Gen AI has some unique attributes. It's cheap, which means you're going to see a lot, broader representation. You're going to see, maybe A/B testing at scale. You're going to see things like much more fan creation, much more individual creation. We could have a world, in 5 years where the biggest competitor to media consumption is media creation, right? What does it mean for something to be rendered in real time, right? Like the idea of, contextual or personalized or emergent or interactive, whatever, you can get the idea here. So I'm just going to caution you all from thinking too narrowly about what Gen AI can do. All right. No, actually, there's two more questions. This all leads to another obvious question, which was posed yesterday, which is, what is the business model of an AI-first studio? And I would say that if it's just to make movies and TV shows more cheaply, that's going to work maybe in the near term, as the major studios are really stuck. They're calcified. They're stuck with legacy workflows and much higher cost structures. I don't think that's a sustainable model longer term, because with no barriers to entry, new studios are going to keep cropping up. I'm sure you saw this. This is the chart from the Fabric report, 100 studios globally. What does this look like in 5 years, right? Is this 1,000, 10,000? There's 130 million YouTube channels. Is this going to be 130 million? I don't know. It depends how you define a studio, right? Also, the big studios are going to lag behind, but they're eventually going to catch up. And so what you see here on the right is what happened to animation post the release of Toy Story. The orange blob thing is CGI, and the blue is hand-drawn or traditional. And the point is that it took basically over a decade after the release of Toy Story, but CGI eventually took over the animation business. And I think that will happen here. Eventually there will be a Toy Story moment in Gen AI, and I think all the studios will be awakened from their complacency. So, publishing is really a cautionary tale here, because when the internet came in, it crushed the barriers to entry in publishing. That was obviously really bad for any kind of incumbent traditional publisher. This is a chart for Lee Enterprises, which is a portfolio of local papers, got demolished. But the very same low barriers to entry that paved the way for Vice and BuzzFeed and Mashable and Mike were also ultimately their undoing. So this is a cautionary tale. Okay, last and final question, and the most important one, is this. What is still scarce when content approaches infinite? Because the good news is that when one input into the production process becomes abundant, other things get scarcer and more valuable. And here's my list. I'm thinking about this list and revising this list all the time. One is compelling original stories, right? Like, what is Gen AI great at? Derivative. It's great at doing things that are kind of like something else. So things that are truly original in an intentional way, not like randomly original or accidentally original, I think are going to be more valuable than ever. Distribution, curation, obviously more stuff. A lot of these actually, as I go through them, are through the lens of the consumer. What filters are consumers going to use to cut through this enormous volume of stuff, this infinite volume of stuff? This is not only algorithmic curation, this is also editorial curation. I mean, that is basically what influencers are, right? Is like, who do you trust? I think trust is, if data was the new oil 10 years ago, I think trust will be the new oil. Consumer time and attention, and what I mean by that is there's a lot of entities that have time, whether it's, brands, or you're in today everyone's an ad network, right? Like you're on your Uber app and you're seeing ads. Wherever you are, there's ads. that attention is very valuable. First party data, tracking, monitoring, and measurement is a mess as it is. Cross-platform, it's going to get much worse. Marketing prowess, right? That's going to be more important, more valuable than ever to cut through the clutter. Real authenticity, provenance, and craft, that's going to be, I think there's going to be a lot of media where people care a great deal about the backstory of how that was created, the underlying human connection of it. Fandoms and community. I think people will choose content sometimes based on the community that is built around that content. Trusted IP and brands, nostalgia and library. You can't create authentic nostalgia, right? That's an oxymoron. IRL experiences, like how do you create scarcity out of something? I think a lot of creators are still going to want professional validation. I think that's one of the saving graces for the major studios. And you can think about what the music labels did, which is this is what they did, is that their value proposition to creators or creatives really changed as the barriers to entry to create and market and distribute went down, and they became these kind of brand magnification marketing machines. And every new musician who rises from the tail of SoundCloud or whatever, the first thing they do is they cut a major label deal. They want the validation. And lastly, talent relationships are also going to matter. So my closing point here is that I think this is the question, the single most important question that's going to determine how value is created and redistributed in media in the next decade. And I think we all should be, continually asking ourselves this question and making sure that whatever we're working on, we're focused on, at least somewhere in the background, we're thinking about what is still going to be scarce. All right, so with that, I will stop. I said I promised that I'd put up the, if you want the slides, the bottom QR code is my contact page on my website. Happy to send it to you, and happy to take questions if we have like 4 minutes. Are we out of time? Oh, okay. Thank you.